Part 1. Left to the snow. She's already dead. The snow took her. I won't waste a single bullet on a woman.
Commander Thorne slammed his heavy fist onto the table, grabbed the nearest soldier by the collar, and violently hurled him across the room, just for daring to suggest a verification sweep. Without missing a beat, Thorne drew his sidearm and fired a single deafening shot directly into the communications officer's knee, the very man who had twice radioed for confirmation.
The next person who questions my judgment crawls home. Thorne poured himself a stiff drink, turned his back to his tactical maps, and never spared a single glance toward the ridge again. That one arrogant decision, that single dismissive laugh, would reduce his entire firebase to ash before the sun ever rose. He left her out there to die. But she came back as something far, far worse. The last thing Harper Vance heard before the world dissolved into a blinding white was the sickening crunch of boots in the snow. They were moving away from her. Not toward her away. She had been lying face down in a freezing snowdrift for what felt like an eternity. Her cheek was pressed so hard against the ice that the agonizing burn had finally faded into a terrifying, deadened numbness. Her left leg was wrong. She knew that in her soul without even needing to look. The twisted angle of it, the dead weight, the terrifying way it simply refused to respond when her brain screamed at it to move. Something was shattered. Maybe everything was. The grenade blast had launched her through the air, sending her crashing down into the bottom of a frozen ravine. The impact had sent a sickening snap echoing all the way up into her spine. Yet, despite the blinding agony, she was breathing. Quietly, slowly, exactly the way they had trained her to. Sergeant Harper Vance, call sign Frost. A seasoned veteran of the United States Army with multiple deployments and numerous commendations to her name. She possessed a very specific lethal set of skills that the men in her unit had spent their early days desperately trying to convince themselves she didn't actually have. She was breathing, and she was listening. "Vance is down," she heard Gallagher say. His voice drifted down from the ridge close enough that she could hear the raw, unmistakable tremor in it. It wasn't grief, she realized with a cold clarity. It was fear. He was terrified. "I saw her go over the ridge. That blast! She's gone." "You sure?" That was Lieutenant Adler. She recognized his clipped, flat, emotionless tone instantly. It was the exact same tone he used when he was doing cold, calculating math in his head. The kind of ruthless math where a human being just became a disposable variable. "I'm sure," Gallagher insisted. "We can't go back for her. The perimeter is already collapsing. If we stay another moment, we're all dead." A suffocating pause hung in the freezing air. Harper counted the beats in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Then we go," Adler finally said. Just like that, she heard the frantic scramble of tactical gear and the desperate crunch of accelerating boots. She lay there and listened to her team, her own team, disappear into the howling storm. Harper remained perfectly still for a long while after the final echo faded into the wind. It was pure, unadulterated training. Even when every shattered instinct inside her wanted to scream, to violently demand they come back, the training held her down. You don't move until you're certain. You don't make a sound until you know the field. Only when she was sure she was alone did she slowly, agonizingly, turn her head to look at her leg. Yeah, it was completely destroyed.
She dragged herself up onto her elbows, her jaw clenched so furiously that her teeth ached in her skull. The pain was absolute. It wasn't a sharp sting anymore. It was a deep, consuming agony spreading outward as if liquid fire had been poured directly into the marrow of her bones and was desperately trying to claw its way out. She breathed through the torment, in through the nose, out through the mouth, exactly as her first drill instructor had beaten into her head back when she was young, unbroken, and convinced she could survive anything.
She couldn't handle this. She was fairly certain no human being could handle this. But she was going to try anyway. Her sniper rifle was still strapped tightly across her back, a suppressed Macmillan TAC 338 equipped with a thermal optic she had meticulously calibrated just days prior. The stock was fractured at the grip from the brutal fall, but when she pulled it around and checked the action, it cycled beautifully clean. 1 round chambered. She did a mental count of the magazine. 9 more. 10 rounds total. 1 lone fragmentation grenade still clipped to her tactical vest. Her sidearm, a Beretta M9 with a single spare magazine. She did the grim calculus exactly how she was trained. She didn't think about long-term survival. That calculation was far too massive, too overwhelming, and far too likely to spit out an answer she couldn't bear to accept. Instead, she focused solely on the immediate future. What do I have? What do I need? What is the first step? The first step was clawing her way out of this icy grave. She was forced to use her beloved rifle as a makeshift crutch. She loathed doing it, hated the very thought of putting that kind of structural stress on a precision barrel, but her options were practically non-existent. She dragged her broken body up the steep slope using only her arms, her good right leg, and a dark, burning fuel that wasn't quite courage and wasn't quite rage, but it lived right in that same violent neighborhood. Every brutal inch of elevation demanded a severe toll. The snow was waist-deep in places, loose and treacherous. Every single time she fought for traction, her shattered leg would violently shift, spiking the pain so aggressively that her vision completely washed out to pure white. She finally crested the top of the ravine after an agonizingly long struggle. She knew exactly how long it took because she mentally counted every agonizing heartbeat. The counting kept her grounded. The counting kept her from obsessing over the sound of Adler's cold voice. Then we go. Those 3 words. The most expensive, devastating words anyone had ever spent on her life. Part 2. The Ghost in the Blizzard. At the top of the ridge, she collapsed, pressing herself flat against a snow-covered boulder, and stared down into the vast, unforgiving valley below. The forward operating base enemy designation, Firebase Valkyrie, sat a long distance to the northeast. She could see its harsh floodlights piercing right through the blinding blizzard. This was a permanent entrenched installation, not some temporary camp. That meant heavy heating systems, massive fuel storage, a hardened communications array, and fully stocked vehicle pools. She'd obsessively studied the satellite imagery for days before this mission. She knew the base's layout as intimately as she knew the floor plan of her own childhood home. Every corridor, every fatal choke point, every blind spot. She had studied it as a target. Now, staring through the storm, she studied it as a destination. Because here was the fundamental truth about Harper Vance, the truth her unit had never quite grasped, the truth her commanding officers only partially appreciated, and the brutal reality her enemies were about to learn in the most violent way imaginable. Harper did not prioritize survival. She prioritized objectives. Survival was merely the byproduct of a successful mission. The original objective had been a high-risk reconnaissance run, get eyes on the firebase, confirm the presence of a devastating mobile artillery unit, relay the strike coordinates for an aerial bombardment, and extract. Adler had unilaterally decided the mission was over. Harper decided it wasn't. She began to move. The trek took a grueling eternity.
It was a torturous, drawn-out crawl, half dragging her broken frame, utilizing every ridge and snowbank for cover, and pausing frequently to check her back trail and listen to the suffocating dark. The howling storm was her greatest ally. Visibility was practically zero, and the violent screaming wind was loud enough to mask the sounds of her agonizing progress. Wrapped in her white and gray winter camo, her thermal signature would be nearly indistinguishable in the blowing ice. She was a ghost. She had always been a ghost. The men in her unit used to make jokes about it. But tonight, it was the only thing keeping her breathing. She was hovering near the outer perimeter when she finally heard the voices. 2 sentries were posted at the northeastern corner of the chain-link fence. Through her thermal optic, she saw their glowing shapes clustered carelessly close together. That meant they were talking. That meant they were distracted. She watched them endlessly without twitching a muscle. Their patrol pattern was a lazy, undisciplined mess. They would stop, chat, wander aimlessly, and drift back together. It was breathtakingly sloppy security. The kind of arrogance that only blossomed when soldiers were absolutely convinced that the night belonged to them.
Nobody expects a ghost. Harper chambered a suppressed round and waited. As a violent gust of wind shrieked across the open ground, she took her first shot on the slow exhale. The crack of the rifle was nothing but a whisper swallowed by the blizzard. The sentry on the left crumpled, instantly dead before he hit the snow. The man on the right turned, deeply confused. Some primal animal instinct flared in his chest, warning him that the world had just fatally shifted. But in the fraction of a heartbeat it took his brain to process that instinct, Harper put a second round flawlessly through the base of his heavy helmet. Both men were bleeding out in the snow before either had the chance to take a single step. 9 rounds left. 1 grenade. She slid under the perimeter fence in a low, agonizing crawl, her shattered leg screaming in protest the entire way. She pressed herself hard against the inside of the compound. Her heart was hammering against her ribs now, not out of fear, but from the intoxicating, terrifying intensity of being entirely committed to the plunge. There was no going back. Honestly, there had never been a way back. Adler had sealed that door shut when he walked away into the dark. Once inside, she took stock of the killing floor. The layout matched her satellite memory flawlessly, save for 2 critical variables. An extra heavy-duty vehicle parked near the armory that shouldn't have been there, and an unanticipated backup generator attached to the communications building. She mentally filed both details away and adjusted her lethal geometry. The armory first. It was always the armory. You sever their claws before you cut their throats. A man with a rifle but no radio is still a profound danger. A man with a radio but no rifle is just a panicked voice begging for a rescue that will never arrive. She flowed through the sprawling base the way water moves through a cracked pipe, seeking the path of least resistance, always moving, never allowing herself to be cornered. The punishing blizzard had driven the vast majority of the garrison indoors. The remaining exterior patrols were minimal and lethargic. She counted 4 more sentries standing between her and the armory doors. She spent precious, fleeting moments memorizing their lazy rhythms before making her move. Throughout the wait, her leg felt as though it were actively being dismantled from the inside out. She eliminated 3 of the sentries with surgical, perfectly spaced shots, ensuring none of them heard their comrades fall. The 4th guard she was forced to take down hand to hand. She ghosted up behind him, using the heavy steel butt of her sidearm in a fast, vicious, precise strike, exactly how they drilled it in close-quarters combat. He dropped like a stone, brutal, but silent. 6 rounds left. 1 grenade. The armory's heavy steel door was secured with a standard-issue military padlock. She had trained on this exact lock during a brutal survival course in the Alaskan tundra. She bypassed the mechanism swiftly, using a specialized lockpick she kept concealed in her boot.
a paranoid habit an old instructor had once mocked, but one she now considered divine prophecy. Inside the armory, she moved with fluid purpose. You don't blow an armory if you want to control the aftermath, she remembered her grizzled tactics instructor Briggs growling at her. You blow an armory when you want to make a statement. Just make sure the statement is the right one. Harper was absolutely going to make a statement, but not yet. Not until Commander Thorne was forced to watch it burn. She spent a brief window of time moving methodically among the heavy weapon crates. When she finally slipped back out into the storm, she left behind 3 very specific parting gifts. A concealed tripwire rigged to a white phosphorus grenade perfectly tucked behind the primary ammunition cache. A cleanly severed fuel line, steadily bleeding under the heavy transport vehicle, and a flawless mental map of the building's load-bearing pillars. When the exact right moment arrived, she was going to pull the thread and watch the world collapse. Pressed back against the frozen exterior wall, she caught the sudden burst of frantic radio chatter bleeding from the communications building across the yard. It was on a standard enemy military frequency. Even through the harsh static and her limited grasp of the language, she caught the terrifying gist of the panic. They had just received a transmission. Something regarding a massive coalition response. Something about a window. A window. That single word echoed in her mind like a gunshot. She didn't know the full context, but in the unforgiving language of tactical warfare, a window meant a strict deadline. It meant whatever massive, bloody operation Thorne was orchestrating from this base was on a rapidly accelerating schedule. Her strike coordinates were supposed to be sitting safely on a satellite uplink that Adler was responsible for transmitting before he cowardly retreated. But Adler had fled without confirming the data upload. She had no way of knowing if the American bombers were even coming. She had no way of knowing if a single soul on Earth was looking for her. She was completely alone, severely wounded, trapped deep behind enemy lines inside a heavily fortified firebase, armed with only 6 bullets and a dying leg. And she had just consciously made the decision to stay until the bitter end. There are defining moments in a soldier's life, where everything that came before, every grueling drop of sweat, every agonizing sacrifice, every condescending voice that ever sneered and told you that you didn't belong here, either crystallized into an unbreakable diamond of purpose or crumbled to dust. Harper Vance had spent years building herself into a weapon. Tonight she was going to find out exactly how sharp the blade truly was. She tightened her frozen grip on her rifle, exhaled a shaky breath against the roaring pain, and limped toward the communications building. Part 3. The ticking clock. Inside the comm center, 2 operators sat hunched over a massive bank of glowing equipment, their backs exposed to the door. A third man, an older, haggard-looking technical officer, hovered over them, aggressively pointing at a sprawling tactical map. Harper watched them through the frosted glass, forcefully locking her pain in a mental box. The older officer barked something sharp at one of the operators. The subordinate shot back a defensive reply, but the officer violently slammed his palm against the table, his voice rising in panic. Harper mentally filed that detail away. A stressed, fracturing command structure. People arguing under pressure make fatal mistakes. She breached the side door, moving in low and terrifyingly fast. The first operator was unconscious on the floor before his brain even registered the shift in air pressure. The second man frantically spun in his chair, his mouth opening to scream, but Harper was already across the room. She locked her forearm brutally across his throat, applying pressure with a geometric perfection drilled into her muscle memory 1,000 times over. In a blur of motion, both men were neutralized. Not dead, she deliberately chose to keep them breathing for reasons she would examine later. The older technical officer scrambled backward until his spine hit the far wall. He was breathing in sharp, panicked gasps, his eyes blown wide in absolute terror as he stared at the bloody, snow-covered phantom that had just materialized in his secure bunker. She could practically see the frantic calculations racing behind his eyes.
"English," Harper demanded. It was not a request. He blinked rapidly. "Some," he choked out through a thick accent. "Good." She stalked toward the map table, her weapon leveled squarely at his chest. "Tell me what the window is." He clamped his mouth shut. "I am not going to ask you twice," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "I just dragged myself through your entire perimeter on a shattered leg. I am not having a good night. Do not test my patience." The officer looked at her. Really, truly looked at her. He saw the cold, dead certainty in her eyes, and instantly realized that this woman would put a bullet through his skull without a second of hesitation. "Artillery strike," he stammered, his hands visibly shaking. "Coalition command post. Position south of here. The window. It opens soon." Harper checked her watch. The deadline was rapidly approaching. A massive, devastating artillery barrage was about to rain down on a coalition outpost, on American soldiers, on Allied forces, who likely had no idea that a rain of fire was hurtling their way. And she was the only human being on the planet positioned to stop the slaughter. Something immense and terrifying moved through her then. It wasn't fear. It was something far larger and infinitely more focused than anger. It was a righteous, burning fury that had been slowly building inside her ever since Adler had callously declared, "Then we go." Honestly, it had been building since the very first time a superior officer had looked at her pristine qualification scores and condescendingly asked, "Are you sure these are right?" She was completely done waiting for verification. She was done seeking permission to exist. "The artillery unit," she commanded. "Where is it?" He hesitated for a split second. She slammed her bloodied hand down onto the map table and stared right through his soul. "Where?" With a trembling finger, he pointed. She memorized the grid coordinates, instantly burning the geography into her mind. "Sit down," she ordered, shoving a chair toward him. "And do not make a sound." She dragged herself over to the glowing communications terminal, her bloody fingers flying across the complex dials and switches. If she could just push a single transmission through the storm, if she could reach a friendly frequency, she could change the fate of the world. She could call down the very airstrike that Adler had cowardly abandoned. She could do them from the inside of a hostile fortress with a broken body and 6 bullets, what her entire elite unit had failed to do with full operational support. "You are one soldier," the older officer whispered from his chair. His voice was steadier, now colored with a profound, terrified awe. "Yes," she replied, never taking her eyes off the flashing screens. "They left you here to die." "Yes." A heavy silence filled the room. "Then why are you still fighting?" Harper almost laughed. The dark irony of it burned in her chest. "Because the mission isn't over," she said softly. "It's never over just because someone decides it's inconvenient." She finally locked onto the coalition frequency. The blizzard was fighting her, drowning the signal in heavy static, but there was just enough of a pulse. She keyed the heavy transmit button and began to speak. Miles away, deep into a quiet overnight shift inside a secure coalition command center, a bored duty officer practically jumped out of his skin as a radio crackled to life. Through the heavy static came a female voice, controlled, chillingly precise, bleeding authority. She delivered her call sign. She rattled off high-priority artillery coordinates. She warned of an impending strike against Allied forces that was shockingly close to execution. The duty officer sat bolt upright, his heart pounding, and immediately demanded security verification. The voice crackling through the storm didn't give a code. She simply said, The verification is that I am still standing here. Write it down. I'll wait. He frantically wrote it down.
Inside the enemy bunker, Harper released the button. She checked her watch. The window of opportunity was violently closing. She still had work to do. She grabbed her rifle and offered the captive technical officer a single, respectful nod. He stared back at her with an expression that bordered on absolute reverence.
Harper pushed back out into the raging blizzard.
Thorne was in the primary command building. She knew the approach. She knew the guard posts. She had 6 bullets, 1 grenade, a dying leg, and a reckoning that had been a long time coming. She moved through the blinding snow like an avenging angel formed from the ice itself, deliberate, patient, and utterly inevitable.
Part 4. The Fire and the Fury. The cold immediately tried to violently claim her again, attacking her battered body with an aggressive, suffocating grip. She ignored it. She ignored the screaming agony in her bones, narrowing her entire universe down to the next few feet of snow in front of her. The transmission had gone through. She knew the massive American airstrike was currently being orchestrated in the sky above, but she still needed to guarantee that the enemy artillery unit was neutralized, and she needed to ensure Thorne was permanently removed from the board before the bombs fell. She crept toward the heavy vehicle pool. Her leg was no longer sending sharp spikes of pain. Instead, it was radiating a dull, sickening throb. It was a terrifying medical sign, but a useful tactical development. Adrenaline had its limits. She needed to survive just a little longer. She heard them before she saw them. 2 armed soldiers rushing around the corner, moving with frantic, uncoordinated purpose. Harper pressed her body flat against the freezing metal wall and held her breath. They sprinted past her, so close she could smell the stale tobacco radiating off their uniforms. The base was waking up. They had noticed the missing sentries. The quiet was shattering. She moved rapidly through the motor pool. Under the groaning, snow-covered roof, she located the heavy troop transports. Working swiftly, she cleanly severed the main fuel lines on multiple vehicles, allowing the highly flammable liquid to pool into the snow. She was creating a lethal, catastrophic chain reaction. When she introduced the right spark, this motor pool was going to erase a multitude of problems. Suddenly, a loud, panicked shout erupted from the direction of the communications building. One of the men she had spared had finally woken up. The shout was instantly followed by the heavy, thundering sound of boots sprinting across the frozen ground. Then the base's primary klaxon triggered. It wasn't a subtle warning. It was a massive, deafening, violent alarm that bounced violently off every corrugated metal wall in the compound. Blinding security lights slashed through the dark. Doors were kicked open. The compound erupted into a frantic, chaotic scramble of heavily armed men who had foolishly believed they were safe. Harper dropped to the ice, pressing herself flat into the shadows, and held her ground. This was the defining moment. This was where pure, unadulterated discipline separated the living from the dead. While every human instinct screamed at her to run, she held perfectly still. She tracked the chaotic sound of the boots, mentally mapping the enemy's desperate response. Most of the garrison was converging on the comms building, the exact distraction she needed. The primary command center would be vulnerable for a brief window of chaos. She forced herself up and surged forward. She hit the first command guard post at a dead sprint. It wasn't the slow, tactical approach she had envisioned. It was a desperate, violent rush out of the blinding dark. The sentry barely had time to raise his weapon before she closed the gap. Driven by pure muscle memory, she took him down in a vicious strike, ignoring the sickening, grinding scream from her own leg. 5 rounds left. 1 grenade. She stacked herself against the main entrance of the command hub.
The second guard was panicking, frantically screaming into his dead radio, entirely unprepared for the violent reality that had just arrived on his doorstep.
"Hey," Harper whispered from the shadows.
The guard spun around in terror. She was already stepping over his unconscious body before he even hit the floor.
The interior of the command building hit her with a physical wall of heat, causing her frozen body to violently shudder as it desperately tried to process the sudden warmth. She planted her good foot, viciously bit down on her lip, and pushed forward. She stalked down the central corridor and kicked open the door to the primary operations center. 3 men snapped to attention. A high-ranking major stood at the central map table, instinctively dropping his hand toward his holstered weapon.
"Don't!" Harper commanded in Russian, one of the few words she had mastered for extreme pressure. The absolute dead certainty in her tone froze the major's hand in place.
Switching to English, she locked eyes with the officer. "The artillery unit. Is it in position?" The major swallowed hard. "I already called the coordinates into Coalition Command," she lied smoothly. "I don't need your confirmation. I'm asking because your answer dictates exactly who walks out of this room alive." The major's jaw tightened in defeat. "It is in position." Harper scanned the tactical map spread across the table. Her eyes immediately locked onto the terrifying red timelines scrawled across the paper. The window of opportunity had been violently ripped forward. The enemy artillery wasn't waiting. The devastating strike was imminent, much sooner than expected. Nobody at Coalition Command knew the timeline had accelerated. Harper lunged toward the communications terminal, shoving the terrified operator out of his chair. It took several agonizing moments to punch through the heavy static and re-establish contact with the American command center. "Frost to command," she barked, her voice echoing in the tense room. "Timeline accelerated. The artillery unit is hot. I need immediate strike authorization on my coordinates. Now." The voice on the other end demanded a lengthy, complex security verification code. "I don't have a damn code," Harper growled. "I am inside Firebase Valkyrie right now, surrounded by hostile forces, telling you that American soldiers are going to be wiped off the map if you don't drop those bombs immediately. You can waste time verifying my voice, or you can start the rain. Your choice." A terrifying silence hung on the line. Then, "Stand by, Frost." She stood her ground in the enemy command center, her weapon leveled at the major, waiting for an agonizingly long time. The major stared at her, watching his entire constructed reality beautifully and violently unravel at the hands of a single bleeding woman. "They told us you were dead," the major finally whispered, his voice trembling with a strange, terrified awe. "It was a bad assumption," Harper replied coldly. Footsteps began thundering down the exterior hallway. A heavy, armed sweep was systematically clearing the building. They were closing in fast. Harper locked eyes with the major. A silent, profound understanding passed between 2 seasoned warriors separated by the lines of war. "The door," she said softly. The major hesitated for only a second before turning and violently throwing the heavy interior deadbolt, locking his own men out. Harper used the first precious moments of the barricade to punch her final tracking codes into the terminal, planting a bright electronic beacon right on top of her own head. "Frost," the radio finally crackled. "We have visual on your grid. The strike package is inbound. Detonation is imminent." The margin for error had just evaporated. The window for escape was suffocatingly tight. "Copy that," Harper said. "Mark my beacon. Do not strike until I transmit the all clear." "Can you hold your position, Frost?" The heavy oak door behind her began to buckle under the violent, desperate impacts from the hallway. "Negative," she said, ripping the portable transmitter from the console. "I'm going mobile." She warned the operators not to follow, gave the major a final nod, and threw herself backward through the shattered glass of the south-facing window. She hit the packed snow hard, her body screaming as the impact telegraphed through her shattered bones. Behind her, the heavy door splintered open,
and she heard the Major desperately screaming false directions to protect her escape.
Harper dragged herself toward Commander Thorne's private quarters.
When she kicked the door open, the room was empty. A lamp lay shattered on the floor. A half-empty glass of amber liquor sat abandoned on the desk. Thorne had run.
But left behind on the desk was a chilling, handwritten note. Thorne had completely bypassed the radio network. He had secretly ordered the artillery to fire even earlier. The math was entirely against her. She was drastically short on time. The bombs would fall too late. The cold logic was perfect and utterly devastating. She snatched up Thorne's abandoned tactical radio and keyed the American frequency while simultaneously sprinting back out into the blizzard. Frost to command. The timeline shifted again. You are too late. I need that strike package pushed faster. Negative, Frost. We cannot advance the payload. Can you delay the enemy artillery? Harper let out a dry, manic laugh. She was heavily wounded, standing alone in the center of an exploding hostile fortress, and the voice in the sky was asking if she could casually stroll outside the walls and politely ask the enemy tanks to stop shooting. She looked at what she had left. She looked at the heavy fragmentation grenade clipped to her chest. She looked at the massive, highly flammable fuel depot sitting dangerously close to the rigged armory. Define delay. I'll buy you the time, she breathed into the radio. She pulled out her remote detonator. She stared at the armory. She stared at the fuel tanks. She pressed the button. The armory didn't just explode. It ceased to exist. A blinding, roaring flash of white phosphorus violently erupted into the storm, turning the dead of night into scorching daylight. The shockwave knocked men off their feet. Instantly, the compromised fuel lines in the motor pool caught the terrifying heat and cascaded into a chain of massive, deafening secondary explosions. A raging wall of fire clawed its way into the sky. Miles away, an enemy artillery crew chief, his finger hovering over the firing mechanism, paused in sheer horror as he watched his own fortress violently erupt into a towering inferno. He frantically dropped his launch orders and screamed into his radio, demanding to know what was happening. The enemy guns went silent. Harper had bought her time. Now the base was drowning in absolute structural chaos. Surrounded by the roaring flames, Harper stood in the shadows, waiting for the rat to flee the sinking ship. Soon enough, Thorne burst out of the smoke, sprinting frantically toward the main evacuation gate. He was flanked by two elite, heavily armed bodyguards, moving with the terrifying efficiency of a specialized protection detail. Harper raised her rifle. 4 rounds left. She couldn't take the shot yet. If she missed, the elite guards would instantly scatter into the darkness and hunt her down like a wounded animal. She needed to separate them. She needed to break his shield. Moving like a phantom, using the roaring inferno as her cover, she aggressively closed the distance, ignoring the blinding agony tearing through her legs. The heat of the blazing compound washed over her face, painting the swirling snow in violent strokes of orange and crimson. She flanked them, waiting for the exact heartbeat when the rear guard turned his head. Harper pulled the trigger. She didn't aim for the man. She aimed for the heavy tactical radio strapped to his hip. The high-caliber round violently shattered the device, dropping the guard to his knees in a shriek of sudden agony and blinding confusion. Thorne flinched, violently breaking his stride. His primary bodyguard desperately threw himself in front of his commander, trying to locate the phantom sniper. But Harper was no longer hiding. She launched herself out of the blinding snow at a dead sprint, moving faster than her broken body should have ever permitted. She slammed into the primary bodyguard from the side, a brutal, bone-crunching impact that drove them both heavily into the chain-link fence. The fence groaned under the weight. Her leg sent a shockwave of pain so absolute that the world briefly faded to gray. But she held on. She came back. She forced the guard down. When she spun around, Thorne was standing just feet away, his sidearm drawn and aimed directly at her chest.
His face was a hard, terrified mask of desperation. He finally realized exactly who was standing in front of him.
"Drop it," Thorne commanded, his voice shaking. Harper didn't drop her rifle. She didn't raise it either. She simply held her ground, staring him down with the cold, dead eyes of a reaper. "You're the woman from the ravine," he whispered. "Yes." Thorne stared at her. "You did all of this alone." "You left me in the snow," Harper said, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "You told your men I was already dead. That was your first mistake." Thorne's trigger finger twitched. "My men will surround this position in moments." "Your men are burning," Harper replied coldly. "And very shortly this entire compound is going to be wiped off the face of the earth by an American airstrike. So whatever you're planning to do, you better do it fast." Thorne stared at her. He looked at the fire. He looked at the sky. His entire empire was crumbling to ash around him. "What do you want?" That was the pivot point. The moment the commander surrendered control to the ghost. "I want you to transmit a total stand-down order to your artillery crew," Harper demanded. "Right now. Voice authentication. And if you do it, you get to walk out that gate and live." Thorne slowly lowered his weapon. He pulled his command radio from his jacket, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. With a trembling voice, he broadcast the total stand-down order to the massive guns waiting in the hills. The acknowledgement cracked back over the speaker. The Allied soldiers were officially safe. Harper let out a long, shuddering exhale. "Walk," she commanded, pointing toward the heavy gates. Thorne took a few steps, then stopped and looked back at her, the blazing inferno framing her silhouette. "Your people left you here to die," he said, genuine disbelief coloring his words. "And you still fought for them." Harper stared back at him. She thought about Adler. She thought about the men who had cowardly walked away without a backward glance. "I didn't do it for them," she said softly. "I did it for the mission." Thorne vanished into the blinding snow. Part 5. The Reckoning. Harper had to run. The American bombers were screaming down from the sky, and she was still standing directly inside the blast radius. She pushed her broken body past the breaking point, dragging her ruined leg through the deep drifts, fighting the storm for every single inch of distance. "Frost, you need to clear the area immediately," the radio screamed. "I'm working on it," she gasped, throwing herself forward. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the trees. A bullet slammed into the ice inches from her face. She dropped instantly into the snow, bringing her rifle up. It was the final bodyguard. He hadn't fled with Thorne. He had stayed behind to hunt her down. "I know you're out of ammunition," the guard's voice echoed through the swirling blizzard. "And I know your leg is completely shattered. Tell me what you stole from the command center, and I'll drag you out of the blast radius. You live." Harper calculated the distance in the dark. She used his arrogant voice as a homing beacon. She didn't respond. She just waited for him to take one careless step. When she heard the crunch of the snow, she pulled the trigger. The guard hit the ground hard. 2 rounds left. Harper dragged herself forward, crossing the invisible line just as the sky ripped completely open. The airstrike wasn't cinematic. It was a devastating, apocalyptic physical event. A massive, concussive wave of pressure violently hit her from behind, launching her violently forward and burying her deep into the snow. The blinding flash of the explosions pierced right through her tightly shut eyelids. The earth violently shook. When the screaming finally stopped, she dragged herself out of the snow and looked back. Firebase Valkyrie was simply gone. It had been violently erased from the geography of the world. She pulled a flare from her vest, ignited it, and collapsed onto the freezing ground. She stared up at the swirling, fiery sky, letting the profound, silent stillness wash over her.
She was alive. When the medical chopper finally broke through the heavy clouds and the blinding spotlight hit her face, she raised a single frozen arm into the air. The medic, Mercer, hit the ground sprinting. He dropped beside her, taking one horrified look at her shattered, mangled leg.
"I know," Harper whispered, her voice barely a rasp. "Just get me on the bird." The flight back was a blur of excruciating pain and fading adrenaline. She lay strapped to the gurney, staring at the ceiling, feeling the massive, crushing weight of the ordeal, finally, violently crashing down onto her chest. When she finally awoke in the blinding, sterile light of the field hospital, her left leg was bolted into a massive steel framework, and both of her hands were heavily wrapped in thick bandages to treat the severe frostbite. Colonel Hayes was sitting quietly beside her bed, nursing a cup of black coffee. The commanding officer radiated an aura of dangerous, suppressed fury. "Your surgeon called your survival remarkable," Hayes said, her voice perfectly level. "I'll take remarkable." Harper rasped her throat like sandpaper. Hayes leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Harper's. "Do you know what you prevented out there? You saved dozens of American lives, and that transmitter you stole from their command center, it contains the most massive, devastating intelligence leak we've uncovered in years." Harper stared at the ceiling. "Lieutenant Adler filed his official report," Hayes continued smoothly. "He reported you killed in action. He claimed the extraction zone was unsurvivable. He completely scrubbed the mission as a total failure." A cold, deadly stillness settled deep inside Harper's chest. "He left me because a dead Frost was a closed file," she said softly. "A living Frost was a problem." Hayes didn't flinch. "There was something else you need to know. That ambush, the one that nearly got your entire squad slaughtered, it wasn't random. Someone intentionally leaked your patrol route. Someone embedded deep inside our own ranks." Harper's hands violently tightened under her thick bandages. The betrayal hit her harder than any bullet ever could. A traitor. Someone she trusted had knowingly sent them all into a slaughterhouse. "I want to be in the room when you take him down," Harper demanded, her voice dripping with venom. "I earned that." Days later, leaning heavily on a crutch and fighting back agonizing waves of pain, Harper stood in the corner of a sterile, windowless interrogation room. Lieutenant Adler was sitting at the metal table. When he looked up and saw her standing there, the ghost he had cowardly left to rot in the ice, all the color violently drained from his face. The cocky, arrogant facade completely shattered. He looked utterly terrified. "How much?" Harper demanded, her voice cutting through the silent room like a blade. "How much did they pay you to sell us out?" Adler stared at his trembling hands. "It wasn't about the money," he choked out, his voice cracking. "It was about escaping. The intel was bad. Command wouldn't listen. I thought if they hit us hard enough, Command would finally abort the operations. I didn't mean to get anyone killed." "You left me in a ravine," Harper whispered, stepping closer, her eyes blazing with absolute fury. "You left your own team to bleed out in the snow to cover your tracks." Adler couldn't look her in the eye. He completely broke. When the military police dragged him out of the room in handcuffs, Harper didn't feel an ounce of pity. She just felt an immense, satisfying closure. Weeks later, the steel fixator was finally removed from her leg. She walked with a slight, lingering limp, but she walked proudly under her own immense power. She was summoned to the commanding general's office. General Sterling stood behind his heavy oak desk, holding a single, crisp folder. "For years, Adler deliberately suppressed your career," Sterling explained, his voice echoing with profound respect. "He knew you were too dangerous, too brilliant. A soldier like you couldn't be controlled. He buried your commendations to keep you trapped under his boot." Sterling slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was an immediate, high-level promotion. Attached to it was an activation order for an elite Black Ops task force. Task Force Sentinel.
Sterling said. "You have total command. Handpick your team. We are going to hunt down every single remaining traitor hiding in that intelligence file you brought back from the fire."
Harper picked up the order. She stared at her name printed at the top. She thought about the freezing ravine. She thought about the howling blizzard, the agonizing pain, and the terrifying moment she decided that the mission was more important than her own final breath. They had left her to die in the snow. She had returned with a fire that was going to burn their entire empire to the ground. She folded the heavy paper, slipped it into her jacket, and walked out into the sunlight. She was just getting started.